Give you a little bit of heads up. I'm going to be moving pretty fast. There's going to be a lot of visuals. We'll be hitting a lot of different locations, different places. Won't be able to go nearly as deeply into every one of those places, but they're there to demonstrate a theme, specifically as it relates to mapping. And so what I'd like to do first, though, is situate who I am, my approach, how I got here. I took the plane from Memphis, or to Memphis, and then the shuttle from Rusty. I like that Rusty guy. And then I want to talk a little bit about the role that mapping can play in the ethics of memorialization. Now, keep in mind that not every geographer maps, even though most in the public think we do, and geographers do a lot more than just mapping. But I want to lean into the theme of mapping because I think it could be pretty helpful to thinking about some methods and ways of trying to address ethics, trying to address memorialization. And what we're going to be doing is talking about mapping both as a method of analysis, but also as a commemorative intervention, as an actual practice of commemoration to make a difference in the memorialization ethics. And in particular, I want to introduce you to a project that is ongoing, and it's not fully baked. Some of the best things are half-baked, like brownies. This is a tough room. But I do want to talk a little bit about this Living Black Atlas, which is a project I'm involved in with Joshua Inwood, a good colleague of mine at Penn State. And one of the things we're going to be getting at is that mapping is more than just sort of the exercise of technical state power, that in fact, if you look at mapping as a form of embodied, resistant storytelling, meaning-making, knowledge-making, memory-making, then I want us to sort of focus in on the role of mapping as it exists as a black form of storytelling. And it's particularly where it's going to end, and I've got an escape hatch. If I run short on time, I'm going to go straight to it, is a project that we worked on at University of Tennessee with a black cultural center dealing with the mapping of the impact of urban renewal. All right, so I'm going to keep moving. Where do I sit within memory studies is I'm probably, like many of you, all over the place in terms of your approaches, but I think if I had to sum it up, it would be that I'm very much an advocate of the spatial turn. And that basically means that place matters. Many of you already do a lot of work in place, so I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but basically memorialization doesn't happen on the head of a pin. Where it happens matters a great deal. And whether you're using the words of location, landscape, infrastructure, these are words we're going to use here in just a few minutes. And then the other part of my approach is what I call a reparative turn. And that's really about the fact that wounds matter. That basically we are a society that's defined by massive wounds created by all kinds of inequalities. And that memorialization is a way for community groups, many of them that I have the great pleasure of having worked with over the years, that are using memorialization as a way of dealing with those wounds in the past and also in the present. And so it gets us talking about memorial justice, community-driven healing, reconciliation, tourism, and so forth. Well, where it all started for me was right here on this screen. I did a dissertation at University of Georgia where I studied the naming of streets after Martin Luther King Jr. I was interested in where those streets had been named. I started all the way back in the early 1990s, have done that work all the way up to the present. And so I wasn't just about mapping those streets in a traditional sense, but I was trying to map where they sat within, at that point, contemporary race relations, where they sat within this project of remembering the civil rights movement. And so this led me and my buddy Owen Dwyer, I hope I'm still his buddy, write a book, Civil Rights Memorials in the Geography of Memory. And one of the things that was sort of a take-home point from our book, and by the way, it's promoted downstairs. You can download a free PDF of it. It's out of print right now. Is that we were basically suggesting that when you see a civil rights memorial, it's not just a monument to the movement, but it is in fact an extension of the ongoing struggle for racial equality and for freedom. And by the way, those pictures of that particular lady there asking for a street to be renamed for King, and those opposed to it, that's from Melbourne, Florida. It took 32 years for a street to be renamed for Dr. King. Now remember, these streets are being proposed by folks who are community activists, NAACP, SCLC, local African American leaders, and so forth. And there's often a place politics that defines those streets. And I don't need to get hung up here because I've got a lot to cover. But many of the proponents want to rename highly visible thoroughfares for Dr. King. And they particularly want thoroughfares that cross racial and economic boundaries within their cities. But what they find, regrettably, is that there's opposition that they encounter. And that opposition frequently keeps King's name and memory segregated socially and spatially. And I think it's with sort of tragic irony that we remember a man who's known for battling segregation by actually resegregating his memory within many cities. And black community activists that have led these struggles, they recognize, in fact, that there is a locational dissonance at work. That, in fact, the goals that they want are not matching the geographies of what is actually happening in those streets. That many of the renamed streets are confined to largely African American and poor neighborhoods. And in fact, a place that I worked before coming to the University of Tennessee at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, there was a huge struggle that took place over the renaming of Fifth Street for Martin Luther King, where these local city fathers and mothers were willing to rename the western part of Fifth Street, which was traditionally black. They were unwilling to rename the eastern part of Fifth Street, which was predominantly white. And in fact, it got so bad, and they resisted those efforts to rename and extend King's name across the whole road, that they eventually just removed King's name from the road altogether and put it on the bypass to keep from having to deal with the issue. And one of the things that's very interesting about Greenville, it's not just a struggle about how our society comes to honor Dr. King, it's also a struggle of how people remembered that particular street. So African Americans in Greenville, North Carolina would tell me in interviews, well, I never went down East Fifth Street. It was always told to me that that was dangerous. I wouldn't dare go down that street. So there were existing racial boundaries that were contextualizing a lot of this memorial struggle. Now this is a very busy, you could tell I love PowerPoint graphic shapes, but this is a very busy graphic that tries to capture some of the politics there at work, and we can't go through all this together, but I want to sort of bring home this idea that something that seems so seemingly sort of basic, like a street sign, is actually deeply mired down into a place politics that's structured by this sort of how much can we recognize and do justice to a reputation like King's, this distributed justice of how do we claim the right to certain public spaces, and how is it shaped by these wider geographies of racial and class divides. And then there's the procedural justice or injustice, because what many communities will tell you is that they will present the proposal to their city council or the county commission to rename a street, and then they are actually out of the decision-making framework. They never get a chance to actually have a say other than to present the proposal. And often what happens is that the street that they really don't want named for King is renamed, or maybe it's their second, third, fourth, or fifth choice. And so one of the things that we often see with these streets, and this is a long wind-up, like a baseball pitch, this is a long wind-up to bringing home a really central idea, is that place and space is part of the calculation of naming those streets. So King's memory is paramount. Remembering the civil rights movement is paramount, but it's never done outside the context of the space and place in which that memory making is supposed to happen. And so many of the common arguments are very much fixated around the importance of place, whether it's this cost and inconvenience of an address change, property values. But really what I've suggested in my work is that those struggles, those opposition, is really about these deeper anxieties about protecting racial boundaries. And what's interesting, or tragically interesting, is that the opponents say that Martin Luther King streets causes a stigma, a place stigma. So we have place that is further contextualizing the politics of remembering Dr. King, where they suggest that blight and crime often accompany these streets. You put King's name on a street, it will bring drug trade. I've heard people say that in public at city council meetings. And the tragedy of it is that it's those very people who are making that argument that are further reinforcing the stigma and making it actually real when in fact it doesn't have to be real. Now don't get me wrong, there are many of these streets that mark places and sites of true social economic struggle. And I've just tried to pull a few headlines from the news to illustrate some of that. But one of the things that I would want to make sure we get across, and this is where, again, I'm like a broken record, where place constantly complicates and enriches our understanding of memory, is that, in fact, when we pay too much attention to that place stigma, it defines the way that we talk about the communities that are identified by these streets. And in many cases, it damages our ability to see these streets and their communities as, in fact, full-fledged communities that are full of creativity, life, joy in some cases. Whether it's, in fact, the many churches that are found along Martin Luther King streets. By the way, that's the #1 non-residential establishment found on all Martin Luther King streets, are churches. Or if it's the barbecue restaurants that are found on Martin Luther King streets, or the barbershops. Barbershops are second or third in the most frequently found institutions, and beauty salons. If you think about the role that those institutions played in the civil rights movement, it's very interesting. Or in the case of Greensboro, Alabama, an actual museum devoted to black history. And the place stigma often ignores the significant development happening on Martin Luther King streets. Now we have to be very careful because a lot of that development is gentrification, and that's just another form of inequality that has been constraining and hurting black communities. But in some cases, like Savannah, Georgia, and Milwaukee, they're actually paying a lot of attention to how that development process. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, and maybe if I seem a little desperate, it's because I'm desperate, is that I'm trying to get across this idea that for me, when I study memorialization, I can never study it outside the context of this larger placemaking that's happening. And then one of the things that you guys have probably already figured out is that we have a life and an afterlife to memorial decisions in politics. You have the life, in fact, the moment in which a memorial decision is made, a struggle is conducted, and then you have the afterlife. Many times memorial studies scholars don't pay a lot of attention to the afterlife. They don't pay a lot of attention to what happens after you build the monument or the memorial, unless it's engaged in tremendous struggle. And in the case of Martin Luther King streets, what we've seen happen is that, in fact, these streets have provoked activists like Melvin White, Terrence Dix, Earl Hardy, to actually use resourcefulness and invoke mutual aid to try to mobilize communities on those streets to redevelop, to claim their own sort of destiny on their own terms. And I have to say, and I'll just take a moment to do this if you'll allow me, Terrence Dix is an activist community leader out of Augusta, Georgia, that I've had the pleasure of working with and learning from for probably 12 years, and Terrence passed away recently. And so this talk this evening, this afternoon, is dedicated to him. But he's a great example that in doing this work and paying attention to place is that, yeah, he was an advocate for Dr. King, but he was as much an advocate for let's make sure that folks living in those communities can eat, they can have employment, they can have education. And so memorialization is not separate from those issues. For him, and I think for me and a lot of others in geography, we see them as absolutely central. And so a lot of the work I do connects memorialization to social justice and what I'll talk about in terms of spatial justice. So spatial justice, that's a long wind-up, I apologize. But I had to lay down the groundwork. And by the look in your faces, you are energized. You are ready for it. But what you find out is that these commemorative inequalities or the chance for commemorative justice or commemorative healing, it happens through wider practices of placemaking. That in fact the placemaking is not incidental to how we memorialize. It is central to the politics. And I would suggest to you, and I really admire the center that you have here, read up about it a little bit, fantastic, is that when you talk about what shapes the ethics of memorialization, for geographers, and we're not the coolest guys in the room. In fact, no one knows who we are. I'm like a secret. We often pay a lot of attention to where does the memorialization happen? How is it spatially arranged? These are some questions we'll take on here in the next few minutes. How is it situated? How does memorialization move? In other words, some memorialization is mobile. The ideas of it move. It actually physically can move people. It can socially move people to action. Memorialization can move people emotionally. It can have an affective power. And then the last question that many of my geography colleagues talk about is, what work does memorialization do in places and communities? So if that's sort of the agenda of the spatial justice of memorialization, that's probably it. Okay, now we're getting to mapping. Now we're getting down to brass tacks. All right, you guys don't get too excited in here, all right, just because I'm about ready to quit my job. Oh, by the way, I did get fired the other day from my Federal Advisory Committee. So I have been fired by President Trump.
I think it got reinstated last night.
I don't know about that.
I'm being serious.
Okay, I'll check into it. I don't want you to get my damn hopes up. All right, but I served on the Advisory Committee for Place Name Reconciliation. Worked for the Department of Interior, and that's what that's about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mapping memory. And I want us to I encourage us for us to be able to do this and talk about how mapping is a method of memory analysis, but also a form of intervention. I want you to think about moving beyond what you conventionally think of a map, what you conventionally think of data, and and who you conventionally define as a map maker. That's pretty important to this process of the Living Black Atlas, in fact. In fact, a lot of times maps are seen to be these objective, neutral statements of reality, when in fact they're not neutral at all. Maps have long been used as what we call political technologies. They've been used to identify, stereotype, value, devalue people, segregate people, whether you're talking about redlining, whether you're talking about urban planning. By the way, that image from the 1960s census where you have folks laying on maps, measuring out, in fact, how probably things are going to be developed, how things are going to be taken apart. That's really the image to me when I think about sort of some of the violence of mapping. It's about people who are not even in the community making decisions and making maps that are going to have an impact. By the way, I don't have a problem with laying on maps. Back at the old inn at the old Miss, I've got some maps in my room. I'm going to go lay on them later. Okay. But when we talk about the Living Black Atlas, it's a very different way of thinking about that mapping. That mapping is this often resistant, self-determined, embodied, social practice, social process of communities of color telling their story, representing themselves on their own terms, and they're using all the creative things we know about, but guess what? They often have also used maps, both conventionally defined, but also more creatively defined. And so I don't have time to go into all this, but for example, you take, for example, NAACP in the 1920s, which developed maps to contest lynching and to try to convince the U.S. government to pass an anti-lynching law. You look at SNCC in the 1960s, which actually created these very unique power maps to try to map how the power of white supremacy was embedded in certain social institutions and corporations. Or if you think about Louise Jefferson, who was part of sort of the Harlem Renaissance, who created these beautiful pictorial maps of Black America and in essence trying to make visible those invisible, neglected Black historical contributions to America. Or Andrea Roberts, who is a planner over at the University of Virginia, a delightful scholar, who has been mapping unmarked Black settlements in Texas freedom colonies, and using that mapping of those freedom colonies to actually push against standard dominant preservation policy and getting them to think about, well, we're defining preservation the wrong way, and it needs to recognize greater diversity. Or Tanika Lewis Johnson out of Chicago, who is just a fantastic artist, photographer, community activist, who has, I don't like to use the word literally, but it applies here, has literally folded the map of Chicago in half, meet itself, where different segregated sides of streets are forced to meet each other and actually talk with each other and do interviews and socialize together. And that's an amazing idea, that the Living Black Atlas is not simply a picture. It's actually a new set of social relations that many people try to achieve through maps. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is give you some examples Don't look sad, Nathan. This will do nothing but get worse. I'm going to give you some examples of how geographers have tried to use maps in terms of studying memory, and I'm going to also then pop in an example or two from the Living Black Atlas. So geographers have really been trying to use a mapping technology and mapping methods a lot to study these wider landscapes and material infrastructures of memory. And what I mean by that is that a memorial is a landscape, but that landscape often forms these broader built environments of living and struggle. And so what a lot of folks are doing are recognizing that we have to contextualize memorials within a larger landscape of infrastructure. We have to understand that that memorial is part of a larger pattern of racialized, gendered, and class patterns of placemaking. This is an example of a project that I have ongoing with George Towers, Pamela Morris, where we are mapping subdivisions, Confederate subdivisions. Either the subdivision is named has a Confederate name, or it has a lot of streets that have Confederate names. And one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to realize or figure out how much of those Confederate name places, because I'm into commemorative naming, that's my thing, that's my jam, all right? How many of those Confederate name places actually serve as markers of white space and of exclusionary white space? And so we're linking those namings to census data that allows us to look at the racial composition of those places that surround those names. Or in the case of, I've done quite a bit of work in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where we look at the just absolutely large frequency of places that bear the name plantation. Now, I understand Hilton Head was the site of several historical plantations, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about gated communities, businesses, laundromats, restaurants that use the word plantation. And that use of the word plantation in a sort of romanticized and sensitive way isn't just about being insensitive, but in the case of Hilton Head, it was very much about taking that island, which belonged to Gullah Geechee, and converting it into a resort, into something marketable. And that was, in fact, a way of dispossession. So commemorative naming can actually be part of these larger infrastructures of dispossession and exclusion. Or like the Pine Valley subdivision in Wilmington, North Carolina, that I've done a little work with, which you have 16 streets named after Confederate generals that all surround a country club. I need not need to say any more in terms of how that naming and that commemorative and that memorialization is working in a very spatially just or unjust way to reinforce divisions between communities, racially speaking. Now, one of the things that's fascinating, and hey, I'm a geek about maps, and I'm a geek about data. I wouldn't say I'm like a world-class expert on it, but GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and data science is really expanding our memory mapping capabilities. And so, for example, we wrote a conversation piece not that long ago introducing the North American Street Names app, which allows you to go on, put any name you want. It will search for any streets in the U.S. or North America, include Canada, Mexico. You can even go over to Europe and do searches if you like, and it will find where that name appears. And in this case, I put in Plantation, and so right now we in the U.S. have about 2,300 streets named Plantation, which again is part of that dynamic I'm talking about, that commodification of the Old South in a way. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this is that this is a great tool for the classroom. Now, this doesn't tell the whole story. This is just a bunch of patterns. This is a map. But this is a way for you to start understanding memory, not just in a very specific site of, okay, here's this memorial, here's this monument, here's this museum, but how does it exist as a larger landscape pattern? Which, I mean, that's fun. At least I'm having a good time. And then let's pop to the Living Black Atlas. How many have heard of the Green Book? I'm desperate. Raise your hands. The Green Book, the African American Travel Guide, developed to guide black travelers to safe spaces, accommodations during Jim Crow. And even though the Green Book does not contain an actual road map, it doesn't contain like a traditional map, it worked as a map in the sense that it guided people to places where they could find refuge or respite. And by the way, it was also a form of memorialization, because if you go deeply into some of the copies of the Green Book, you find very interesting ways that certain black establishments were named. Harriet Tubman Hotel, Lincoln Hotels and Restaurants, even Harlem Hotels well outside of New York City. And it gets you thinking about how the Green Book, if you see it as a map, and I do, it's actually a map of infrastructures of care. Right? So the previous maps were about some pretty hostile infrastructures, and this is much more about infrastructures of care. I may pat myself on the back about that later on when I'm laying on those maps. All right. Boy, this is tough. You try to squeeze a talk in between those great tours and the reception that's downstairs waiting on us. So we also have been using in geography mapping to try to expose some of the interconnections within and between memorial sites and practices. One of my favorite colleagues of all time, in fact, he probably should be up here speaking. Don't tell him I told you that. Up here speaking rather than me is Steve Hanna at Mary Washington. And Steve has done some incredible things with using maps and in relation to memorialization. And so, for example, he has mapped every historical marker, every historical site within Fredericksburg, Virginia. And he's not just mapped it, he's tried to develop ways of understanding how those memorial sites are connected with each other, how some of them are more central and how some of them are more peripheral. And he's actually developed this index. And if you're interested, I can send you the paper, it's listed there, where he has, and I've got to get this right, a visitability index. Only an academic could come up with a word like that. A visitability index, which is not just about telling us where there are black historical markers that reference black history, but how are they located relative to tour routes? How are they located relative to retail districts? How are they located relative to other historical and heritage attractions? Because think about it for a second. Simply creating a memorial and having it say something important about black history, that's important. But if it doesn't have sort of an ability to make connections with other people and places, to have a larger situation, as we say, then its efficacy is limited. Or if it's crowded up with other historical markers and it's having to overcompete for attention. And one of the books that's referenced downstairs, and I appreciate if you buy a copy, is a book that describes a project we did. It was financed by the National Science Foundation. That's quite an achievement, because we will never see this NSF fund anything like this again, I'm afraid. But we did a study of plantation museums in 3 different regions in the U.S. In the South, there are shown there. James River, Charleston, and the River Road there in Louisiana. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to get a sense of how much those 17 plantation sites that we had chosen, how much did they talk about the enslaved or the formerly enslaved? How much justice did they do to that history? And importantly, we were wanting to talk, we didn't just take tours, we wanted to talk to people who ran the tours. We want to talk to the people who managed the sites. We want to talk to people who were part of the communities around those places. And what we did is we developed then a theoretical framework or an approach that says that those museums work as an assemblage, that they have all these parts that work together or sometimes work against each other. And that in fact, if you want to do justice to the history of slavery, you don't just change one part of that assemblage. You have to change the whole part. You have to change the whole assemblage. You have to reorder it all. And so what we were trying to do there, this is not like traditional mapping, is we were trying to map the interconnections that worked at these museums to help tell the story. And why was there not more said about African American history? Well, that had not just to do with a tour, it had to do with a manager. It had to do with a manager working with a particular political economic structure. And so it was all those parts as an assemblage. And so that was a very relational approach that is part of this mapping. You know, and from the Living Black Atlas, raise your hand if you've been to Montgomery, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, right? That's a tremendous example of a map that doesn't look like a map. You enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and you are surrounded by these suspended steel monuments that mark the counties and the states and the victims and the timing of those racialized terror murders, right? And so those things, have a big effect on you. My buddy Perry Carter, who does terrific work, has suggested that combined with all the art that is happening at that particular memorial is creating an empathic witnessing for the visitors. But I would suggest to you that the power of Bryan Stevenson's memorial there goes beyond simply those monuments. Part of the power of that site is how the Equal Justice Initiative is remapping the scale at which we remember. So he's bringing in the national and the local and the state, bringing it together in one. He's bringing past and present, because he would say, we were remembering these lynchings because we got to do that to be able to deal with penal injustices. We've got to do that to deal with folks in the police violence. And so, and I've tried to write this out, as another great geographer, Rebecca Sheehan, and her colleagues have said that the power of that particular memorial is that, in fact, it can circulate, it can move, it can jump scale. So geographers study scale. We say, well, things operate at national scale, local scale, global scale. Well, that memorial is jumping scale. It's operating at multiple scales. It's also forming networks between people and places and organizations. And so, for example, we have people in local communities that are filling these jars of dirt at sites where people were lynched. All right. One of the other things that's pretty interesting when you think about it is that we can do this sort of making these connections between memorial sites, not just on traditional maps or even very highly charged symbolism, but we also can create what we call story maps. I don't know how many have ever made a story map? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. It's about taking traditional maps, blending in multimedia. It could be video, photographs, it could be oral counts, and you're creating a way of storytelling that's a form of mapping, but it's not constrained to just the traditional map that we know. And so my good friend Josh Inwood and I have put together a story map about Montgomery and about the Equal Justice Institute and about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And one of the things that we do in that story map is that we put landscapes in conversation with each other. So think about that for a second. How do we bring more meaning to memorialization? We take that memorial and we then put it in conversation with other memorials. We then put it in conversation with other everyday places. Rhonda took us on a great tour of civil rights related history here, and I didn't say anything. I know you accused me of not asking any questions. That hurt me, but I'll move on. But what the power of Rhonda's tour is that she's putting landscapes and sites in conversation with each other. She's having them talk back to each other. That's a form of mapping in which we're looking at connections between places. And that's exactly, you're a damn geographer, all right? And then also mapping can be about mapping spatial narratives. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by spatial narratives and actually mapping the movements that give meaning to places of memory. All right, keep moving on. One of the things that we came out of our NSF project, looking at those 17 plantation museums with big NSF money, $500,000, that was incredible. It was. I've never gotten that kind of money, and we did a great study with it. But one of the things that we got out of that is we developed a methodology for trying to map spatial narratives. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that plantation museums, and really any historical site or memorial site, has a spatial narrative. Think about, for example, and we did it on our tour just a few minutes ago. We visit these memorial sites. People experience memory in the past by moving through space, by moving through and touching, or maybe always touching, but seeing artifacts. And in fact, in geography, we call that an affective architecture, right? That's an affective architecture. That is a built environment that affects us. And so where you tell stories and where you don't tell stories and what order you shape those stories and tell those stories shapes its meaning. And so my buddy Steve Hanna, again, you should have invited him. But I appreciate being here. But Steve Hanna has done some incredible work. And remember, it's part of a team. Unlike other fields, and I'm not picking on anybody, geographers aren't afraid to collaborate. In fact, we realize that we can't get as much done if we're only working alone. So sometimes, like our book has 6 authors. UGA Press says, we've never had a book with 6 authors. Well, get in line, buddy, because this is the way it's going to be. But the point is, there's no way we could have pulled any of that off without collaboration. And so it's Steve and it's all of us, Amy Potter, Perry Carter, and many others. And so one of the things that we do is we think about how does one move through a plantation museum? How does one move through the big house, as they have all traditionally said? And what do you encounter as you go through that particular space? And because how you go through that space will affect the meaning it has to you. So for example, this is from Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. This is where we took a number of different tours and we mapped out what was said where in each of the rooms. And from that, we could then put together a graphic to show you the relative importance or unimportance that was devoted to enslavement. And this is an example of narrative mapping. You take several tours, you document where the enslaved or formerly enslaved appear, how much they're spoken about by both the guide, the tourist, and then you're able to actually see a schematic that allows you to see those narratives at work. And what you can see from this particular, and I'm trying to pick on Magnolia House, but it only had 60% of tours that we took mentioned slavery, and on average only 4 times. And you can see that it took very distinctive spatial patterns in terms of when enslavement was discussed, right? Only certain rooms. And in fact, rooms that should have been included in that discussion were not part of this. So let's contrast this to, everybody knows about Whitney Plantation on the River Road, known as one of the more prominent slave-centric, black-centric plantation museums or sites. I'm not even really sure they would really categorize them completely as a plantation museum at all, and I think that's actually fair. But if you look at the spatial, the narrative mapping we did, and I know you're going to get mad at me, but I want to step aside and use my pointer here. And you can see that the green is enslaved or slavery, and you can see that there is what Perry Carter calls an inverted spatial narrative. In other words, slavery is everywhere on that tour. And in fact, it's not just inverted in the sense of how much it's discussed. 63 times per tour, 100% of the tours, 11 of the 11 tours. And you can see that it starts with these very important memorials here in the slave cabins and then ends with the big house rather than starting with the big house. That's an example of some of the spatial narrative mapping. So Whitney's spatial narratives challenge what Arnold Maudlin and I have called sort of the affective inequality that's often at work at plantation museums. That in fact tourists are encouraged to create these emotional connections in ways that is not happening necessarily at other places. Now, does that spatial narrative or that narrative mapping show me everything? Does it give me all the context? No. It's a beginning point, or it's perhaps a middle point to a larger analysis, okay? Or, for example, one of the things I think is really cool, a lot of people ridicule me about this, I love tour guides. I love taking tours. Not just yours, Rhonda. I love taking tours. And I love taking tours because often you will run onto a tour guide that's actually saying something very revolutionary about a place and about memory. They're not always just robots repeating the same old thing. And so, for example, at UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin, Edmund Gordon, who's a African American Studies professor there, has led for many years a tour of the campus at Austin, the racial geography tour. It reminded me a lot, I keep picking on you, right? Reminded me a little bit of the tour we had today, where in fact, like you, he says you're going to see racism hidden in plain sight, right? You're going to see history hidden in plain sight. And so he's actually he's doing a tour where he's moving people through the campus and exposing them to monuments and memorials that say some very important things about race, white supremacy, and also some everyday spaces that probably don't say anything explicitly about racism, but nevertheless they speak to it. Or if you go to Paris, France, you have Dr. Monique Wells, who leads a tour related to Black Paris. And in this case, one of the things that Monique Wells is doing is she has single-handedly created a tour of Paris that retells the story, recovers the story of Buford Delaney, American modernist painter out of Knoxville, originally from Knoxville. In fact, she's played a major role in actually preserving his burial site, which had been long forgotten. So it's a great example that when we think about maps and mapping out movement, that in fact tour guides are placemakers. And tour guides can actually be anti-racist in some of their strategies. Okay, that gets us to the final one here, I promise. The pain will end soon. That in fact we can use mapping to think about atmosphere. And what do we mean by atmosphere? Well, we're about to have some atmospheric disturbance here in Oxford. You see how I made a connection there? My God, this is tough. Yeah, I hear you laughing, buddy. All right. But atmosphere within the geography literature refers to the feel of a place. It refers to the connections that people's bodies and senses and material conditions and histories and identities form. It's sort of, you ever walk into a place and get an uneasy feeling? Well, that's part of an atmosphere. You walk into a place and you feel exhilarated. That's part of an atmosphere. Some of it is planned and choreographed by institutions, and some of it is unplanned. It happens. It's almost like a haunting. Well, if you think about this, is that when you map out atmosphere, you are not, and map out places of memory, you don't always have to use lines and points and polygons. In fact, when you start really mapping out atmosphere and this notion of a sense of place, that's another thing geographers do a lot of studying of, is sense of place. People's place attachment, the identification they have with place, the avoidance they have with place. Sometimes sense of place can be negative. Think back to yourself. I do this with my class. I won't make you fill out any sort of paperwork. Places you love, places you hate, places you fear. That sense of place, right? That's part of how do we map that? That's very loose. It doesn't coordinate. It doesn't reduce itself to a coordinate. So sometimes you got to look at people's creative products. For example, I don't know if you guys know this, but in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, near where I'm from, there is a Titanic museum. I didn't know the Titanic had found its ill-fated destiny there, but you can go there, and we've written a chapter that looks at that museum, and what we've suggested is it has this atmospheric instability, that part of the museum is trying to really honor the dead, and then part of the museum is trying to sell you stuff, and it's trying to entertain you. And so, for example, you can get a Titanic thing from the gift shop there, or Elvis fans in Graceland, where I've done some work on the inscriptions that fans and non-fans leave on the wall in front of Graceland. And what's happening there is that's where visitors are actively co-creating the atmosphere of that particular site. And I've done some work with hurricane graffiti and also hurricane tattoos. So if you're all game for it, we'll go out and get a tattoo after this conference. That would be a nice way to remember it. But nonetheless, we actually have looked at people. I don't know if you've ever been around or been in a place where you had hurricanes, but you spray on these plywood your inscriptions, your expressions, right? And people do it year after year after year. And so that inscription writing is a way for not just to protect themselves from the storm, but it's a way for them to tell themselves and other people around them, we've been through these storms. We're resilient. So it's actually creating, through sort of a creation of the memory of those storms on plywood, it's creating this atmosphere. And then we did a project down in New Orleans right after Katrina, seems long ago, where in fact we looked at people getting tattoos related to Katrina, related to New Orleans. And those tattoos were memorials. And then very much when we interviewed the folks that had those tattoos, we found that it was very much geared by their feelings about the city. And those tattoos are a form of mapping, just like the hurricane graffiti, just like the inscriptions on the wall. And keep in mind that from the Living Black Atlas, there are many examples of interventions being made in the atmospheres of places of memory. And these, I'm not going to have time to do justice to all these folks. They're incredible. Danny Drain, who used to run the Slave Relic Museum in Walterboro, South Carolina, he ran an innovative museum where African Americans could go to that museum. Anyone can go to that museum, but particularly African American school groups and others can go, and they can hold actual chains and shackles from enslavement. And what he was doing was he was about creating an atmosphere. He was trying to remap the bodies of people visiting that place to memories of the diaspora and to the memories of enslavement in a very graphic way. Abigail Jordan in Savannah, Georgia, who is responsible. If you ever visit Savannah, Georgia, go to River Street. It's a great place to go. You'll find a monument or memorial to the slave trade. And she fought, and she almost put herself in the grave with poor health to get certain words put on that memorial. And she struggled to get that memorial on River Street. And she told us straight up, because we did some very nice interviews with her, she wanted that memorial on River Street because she wanted every visitor that came to Savannah. 6 million go down River Street every year. She wanted every last one of them to see that statue, that memorial. Or Suzanne Ferguson, who I've worked with on Confederate named schools, and she's actually interviewed teachers and students at those schools to find out how they feel about going to school at a place that's identified with a defender of slavery. And what I'm trying to get at here is that in the Living Black Atlas, there's many, many ways that people are mapping and making these connections to affect and to emotion. Okay, this gets us down. All right, I'm going to make this. I want to end with a little bit of a case study that one of the things that I've been really enjoyed doing the last several years is working with a community group in Knoxville, Tennessee called the Beck Center. And the Beck Center is an African American museum, heritage advocacy group, a general redevelopment advocacy group. And what our geography department and our students and our faculty have been doing is supporting the Beck Center, because what they're interested in doing is reconstructing the public memory of Black Knoxville before urban renewal. And like many cities, Knoxville was decimated. Their Black communities were decimated by urban renewal. And I'll give you some examples and some specifics. But what they're wanting to do is use mapping within the sort of emotional, affective register, ethical register. They're wanting to use mapping to restore a sense of place, a sense of belonging within what they see Knoxville as a wounded city, in the words of Karen Till, another geographer. This is like a commercial for geography. Sorry. And the Beck Center is the one in charge of this project. It's not our department. We are providing resources, we're providing labor, we're providing some technical help. But the Beck Center has defined cartography, map making, and data as a memorial practice. They want on a map to show what was there before urban renewal. What were the Black places, the Black social spaces, the Black communities that were there before urban renewal went through. And so they are very much about using mapping to remember and to mourn and to reclaim. And I would point out to you that we have approached this relationship as trying to build partnerships of trust. This is not about academics doing what they traditionally have done, and I honestly probably have been guilty of doing myself, frankly. It's parachuting in and being the expert. But this is about being helpful. And so, again, I don't have time to go into all of this, but we have a very devastating impact of urban renewal in Knoxville. Over 2,500 families displaced, most of them Black. 15 churches were removed. 2 churches alone were removed to build the Civic Auditorium, which is atrocious looking. Many of the 107 Black-owned businesses did not survive. The Beck Center was established in 1975 in direct response to the trauma of urban renewal. They knew that they had to have an institution and a place to actually engage in the memory work of remembering what was there before urban renewal. And so they have a house that houses the Beck Center. It's run by Renee Kessler, who's pictured there, a great partner of ours. And I threw in a picture of some bulldozers that were clearing out one of the streets. You guys have heard Nikki Giovanni? That's Nikki Giovanni's grandparents' street. And she, in fact, talks about urban renewal in some of her writing, some of her poetry and other stuff. And she's a before her passing, was a great advocate for the Beck Center. And again, I'm sorry, Nathan, I'm going to step over here. I'm going to move fast, brother. All right, this is not necessarily the only map that was created or that we created, but this is a map I want to sort of illustrate to you what was lost with urban renewal. So I want to pay attention. You see that dotted line there? Somebody yell that you see it. All right, that is the area that was raised. Wherever you see a light green street, that is a street that was removed because of urban renewal. I'll go one step further. This is a map showing black-owned residential areas and non-residential areas, and you'll notice that those in sort of pink or reddish are black. And one of the things you'll see, let's look back at that raised area, disproportionately African American, huge concentration of residents. And this is actually one of the more iconic photographs. This is Church Street, which if you don't know Knoxville, it's okay. Church Street's one of the big streets that runs through Knoxville. This is Church Street before urban renewal. Everything you see is a lot of trees, but a lot of houses, a lot of institutions. That is large portions of black Knoxville. All right? Now I'm going to show you another slide that shows you after urban renewal. And so what then you can see is you can see that civic auditorium, right? And then you can see all the, you also see that accompanied the urban renewal was highway development. And in fact, the extension of an expressway that went around Knoxville, or parts of Knoxville. Now, one of the things that the Beck Center wanted, and this is really very much of their own words, is they wanted to create what they call, or what we call with them, a geo-memory overlay. What they wanted to do is they wanted to take the standard map of Knoxville that you see here, and they wanted to lay over what was there before urban renewal. And they wanted to do that because they wanted to remind people what was once there. This is a way of elevating public education about that trauma, elevating about the contributions of African Americans. And so when you overlay, so I'll go back, you overlay, that is old historical maps of what was once parts of the African American community there in Knoxville. And the reason we were able to create, and our overlay looks better than this, but I'm just trying to show you how this overlay is something that they wanted. We were basically able to do it by using Sanborn fire insurance maps and also city directories, and then geocoding those institutions from those particular data sources. So I got to move here. And part of it was that the overlay was meant to produce a counter storytelling. So the Beck Center, and this is what I think is brilliant, the Beck Center didn't want to just create a map. They wanted to create a resource that could be used to educate. It could be used in the schools. They wanted a map that could then be used to develop heritage tourism. And it also could guide the creation of historical markers. And it could actually then be used in city political negotiating to advocate for more resources within parts of the surviving community that still need help. And in this case, this is a better looking overlay. You can see all the highways, and you can see, in fact, two of the more prominent African American institutions, the Undertakers, that is the oldest black business in Knoxville, and then the very first black-owned hotel or motel. And again, they wanted to use this map to provoke. So the map wasn't just a method of analysis. It was a memory practice. It was an intervention. So working with and supporting the Beck Center was transformative for many of our students. And one of the things that we recognized right off was that we came into the scene thinking about cartography one way, and the Beck Center taught us to think about cartography in a different way. And we were rethinking the pragmatics of mapping. It was more than just technical operations. It was more about just laying over data or geocoding or matching up addresses. That in fact, you had to center feelings and ethics and histories and rights within that data. And that is the Living Black Atlas. It is not just sort of adding black histories to existing mapping. It is using those black histories to redefine what counts as a map and who counts as a map maker. And in fact, the students discovered that they had to exercise a great deal of ethics of care when it came to data. that they were often geocoding, helping the DeBeck Center geocode the location of the historical black places on the current map. And in doing so, they were exposing spatial violence. They found that streets were renamed or completely gone. They found, for example, and again, I'll go back to my little pointer here, I'm sorry, this is the Gym Theater, which is one of the more prominent theaters before urban renewal, all black theater, segregated. And it actually occupied this part here on what is the contemporary photograph. And that right now is a dog park. And so when the students discovered that by doing that kind of ethically geared, driven mapping, they were horrified. And through that, they were able to develop relationships with the Beck Center that they previously didn't have before. And this is a gentleman who passed away not too long ago after Terrence himself, Robert Booker, a prominent African-American civil rights activist, historian, and he was important to this work. And he, because a lot of these data sources don't exist. These points don't exist. And what he did was he told us stories of where things used to be located. He lived during the time of pre-urban renewal. He told us where he filled in the incomplete holes in the data. He did what we call in geography, he ground truthed it. He did ground truthing. And he had his own mental map. He was a very sharp guy, had a sharp mental map. He could tell you, he could look at that highway and say, you see the middle of that highway? That is where we had a grocery store, right? And so we used the elders to help inform the mapping process. I'm going to skip that. It's not that it's not important, but I want to get to this. This is the last thing I need to say. So what our faculty and students learned from the Living Black Atlas was some pretty big lessons. And this is what I'm most proud of. We didn't just parachute in, call ourselves experts, lend some software, lend some hardware, and then get out. We became part of the initiative, and we actually benefited more than I think the Beck Center benefited from us. And what we learned from this relationship and from the Living Black Atlas and this memorialization is that we had to recognize the importance that the role that we were playing in creating an emotional engagement with the effects of renewal. That, in fact, what we learned, and we asked students to tell us about this, and it's in the paper that I'll give you access to in a minute, that maps should inspire action, not just depict information. And we also had to recognize that there's a danger in re-traumatizing black communities, because many of our students made this sort of error of referring to black communities as being erased, when in fact they were still very much there and still very vibrant in other places. So maps they're not perfect. They have limitations as forms of memorialization. Maps can perpetuate a forgetting even as they're trying to remember or honor somebody or something. And then we had to recognize that geo-memory overlay that I showed you, it was not just identifying black loss, it was identifying black self-determination. That in fact, one of the things that's problematic about mapping, and this is why I'm wanting to stretch how we refer to mapping, is that when you reduce people to points or to lines or to like areas on a map, you're oversimplifying their lived experiences. You're not doing full dignity to them. So all this mapping has to be done with a whole regiment of other memorial practices in history making. All right, final remarks. Placemaking is important to the politics of memorialization. Geography is not passive. I think we're all going to get brochure tattoos. Geography is king. Wider landscapes, interconnections, movements, atmospheres of memory, they reflect and shape spatial injustice. And so very much the Beck Center is about spatial justice. It's not just about memorial justice, it's about wanting to affect a change in the way Knoxville sees those communities and actually interacts with the black communities in the future. And then mapping memory is powerful. It's too important to be left to government, corporations, and academics. And that's why the Living Black Atlas is such a quintessential sort of expression of memory and geography and place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. That was really fantastic. So, Alex Lichtenstein from Indiana University. So, on the one hand, very, very inspiring. I mean, a very concrete question is, did you or the Beck Center ever connect with the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, which has done much the same thing. And indeed, thinking of lying on maps, it's the same kind of neighborhood. It was, you probably know the history. So they recreated a map of the community that apartheid planners had bulldozed, and it's on the floor of the museum. And when you walk in the museum, and many of the people from that community who had been removed and displaced to other parts of the city come back, and they bring their artifacts, but they also walk on the facsimile of the streets of their old neighborhood. It's very, very powerful. So I can connect you with people there if you're interested, because it's really, really parallel in all the ways you're saying. But then a question, I mean, that's a little more depressing. I mean, you mentioned just in these 45 minutes, I would say 3 or 4 places that are now being, I've been thinking about this the last 48 hours, that our government is now digging up the Stolperstein, if you know the Stolperstein, right?
I do.
The Trump administration is digging up the Stolperstein in this country, right? River Road is being decommissioned as a National Historic Site. The Rosa Parks Museum is losing its lease in a government building. As you said, you did this with an NSF grant, and that's not going to happen in the future. And then you yourself, who was a consultant through the Interior Department, have been fired. So that right there, that's one person you mentioned in just 45 minutes or an hour, 4 examples of the Stolperstein being dug up. So what are we supposed to, how do we defend against this? I know it's a tough question.
Well, no, that's a very good question. I wish I had the answer, because I would go around and give it to everybody. You know, I think I think the one thing I would say, and I think in this way the Beck Center is a bit of an inspiration. So it doesn't mean the Beck Center hasn't relied upon government funding. And in fact, the city of Knoxville back in 2022, maybe 2023, issued a formal apology for urban renewal, and actually threw some resources at it, and they benefited from that when that was great, but there was a lot more that needed to be done. But they have been, I think, amazingly entrepreneurial and very strategic in making connections with a host of different institutions, including business interests and developers. They do not allow those folks to take advantage of them, but they are able to create a revenue stream that goes beyond just the traditional things that we're talking about. And I'm not saying that should be the answer. The answer should be that those places shouldn't be under attack or shouldn't be decommissioned or delegitimized. But I think it's the same conversations we're having in our universities right now. Our director of research at UT in Knoxville told us straight, I'm president of the faculty senate there, told us straight up in an executive council meeting that we have to diversify our revenue, our funding streams. And I don't like it, but the truth is it looks like it's probably going to be the way of the world for a while. My fear is that when you decommission and you defund, you create a legacy that's hard to come back from. You know, you don't just overnight say, oh, let's go back and do it all the way we used to. That afterlife is what kills you. I'm sorry, that probably isn't a satisfactory answer, but that's the best I got.
You mentioned that when teaching urban renewal, students would often fall into saying something had been erased, the neighborhood had been erased, and that you thought that was not what you were trying to get across, or the message you were trying to get across. So how do you prepare in a teaching way to get them not to make that mistake?
Well, you know, and so just using the word in and of itself, erased, is not a massive problem. I mean, I use the word erased all the time depending on the context. It's more about I don't want that frequent use of that word to become sort of like a frame that keeps them from thinking more broadly and critically. And I think the way you do it, and honestly, it's not just students, it's faculty too, because we had a big faculty team along with the students, is that we had to keep reminding ourselves, and I'm going to end up owing you money in all this. Yeah, I am. I'll buy you a drink or something. But, you know, Rhonda kept talking about negotiation, that we've got to see the realities of racialization, the realities of inequalities in a very negotiated, sometimes nuanced way. It wasn't one way or the other. And that's what I usually try to say to the student, is that, yeah, we are documenting erasure in the sense of that community being removed from the landscape. But there have been ways in which those communities have found ways to be resilient and survive and to be seen and heard that maybe don't show up as much in that particular landscape, but they show up in other places. For example, in Knoxville, I ran out of time, I apologize. Another part of our geography team, it's not my part of the team, but another part of the team is working with an institution there in Knoxville that was also impacted by urban renewal called The Bottom. And it's a community center that is all about sort of recovering those memories of self-determination. And so they, in fact, organized a tour and put everybody on a bus and had residents who used to live in Knoxville before urban renewal, and they would actually ride along and point out for people what had used to be there, and they would tell stories. And one of the things you got from that tour was that they're not erased, right? It's more sophisticated than that. Now you ask a lot. I've been watching you. You like to ask a very tough question, so I'm scared to death, brother.
Two persistently hopeful comments. One is for people who are not from Oxford, speaking of the EJI memorials, that there is one. We are the first county in Mississippi. Those are the Lafayette Community Remembrance Project. And I don't know if Castile is here. But so we invite people to go to the square to see that very first plaque that was put up in the state of Mississippi. And so memorializing those 6 victims of lynching. And the second one, here we go. I'm just saying.
I know it.
Here we go. Late last night, Source Newsweek magazine, U.S. District Judge William Ossopp ruling on a lawsuit brought by federal employees unions. He directed 6 departments, I'll just read the one, including the Department of the Interior, to offer reinstatement to all employees who were fired. So may it be you, sir.
All right.
I really don't know how to ask this question, so it's more of a comment. Because it has to do a lot with Dr. Seck's work at Whitney Museum, the memory of the ancestors of those who were enslaved. I'm currently doing research on Phyllis Wheatley and making those connections and trying to find her original name, right? And her original village, and trying to tap into how that happens. And so it's like, this is interesting to me because you also spoke to the spirituality of all of this. It's very ethereal. You can't really touch it, but it's a memory. And it's how do we tap into that ancient thing? And I don't know how to ask the question, but it's just something that has just struck me in your presentation. And I'm just hoping you have something to say about it.
Well, and Eliza Kelly, who's a fantastic scholar, published a piece in the Anapode. I guess that was probably early 2020s, and actually did an analysis of the work of Toni Morrison, and mapped out sort of these what she called fugitive maps that run through the words and memories and meanings of literature. And I think part of it is somebody like Catherine McKittrick, who's like one of our main leaders in black geographies, would suggest that we can't be constrained by sort of what has come to count conventionally as the map. We've got to constantly be finding ways that we can touch those fleeting, ephemeral, but very important maps of meaning, maps of memory. There's a very influential book written about critical cultural geography many years ago. Catherine McKittrick's is Demonic Grounds, but the other book was called Maps of Meaning. And it was an attempt by some British geographers to actually get us thinking about maps in different ways. What are the ways that we create meaning, and how does that operate as a map? Now, I will tell you that within my field, because I've presented this work in different places, not this presentation, I create something new for you guys, because you deserve it. But when I've talked about the Living Black Atlas and sort of this alternative cartographies that we're talking about, I'm a heretic because there's certain sort of hardliners that believe a map is a map, and you're diluting the importance of maps by trying to get us thinking about what can count as a map that traditionally hasn't been counted as a map. And that's really sort of the crux of the Living Black Atlas, is that we've got to move beyond the Western science dogma, and we've got to embrace what indigenous communities, black communities, women communities. I had a PhD student. She wasn't my PhD student in the sense of being an advisor. I served on her committee. I was telling somebody about this over dinner just last night, that she did sermon maps. So she comes from the black church. She's an ordained minister. Her father's ordained. And so she was interested in black women as cartographers. And so she actually sat with a group of black women elders from her church in South Carolina and had them draw maps, just hand-drawn images. And they didn't have to look like a map. They were just renderings based on what they had heard that morning in the sermon. And how did it spark sort of their situation of themselves in the world? And then she had them, almost like auto photography, photo elicitation interviews, she then had them unpack that over hours. And then they engaged in a joint collective discussion. Social scientists would call it a focus group. It was richer than that. You see what I'm saying? And then I think I maybe have something here. So Sonia Barrett, who is I think she's still living in the United Kingdom. Back several years ago, she did a mapping project called Dreading the Map. And what she did, and I was going to show you an example, but I just ran out of space and time. I knew Deborah would kill me. Is that she had old maps from Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and she shredded them. They were surplus maps held in the Royal Geographical Society. And she had them shredded. I know it's the end of the time. She shredded them, and then she got together what she called a map collective. It was a group of black women living in the United Kingdom, and they wove those shredded maps into dreadlocks. And then they hung them in the Royal Geographical Society like it was like any normal map. And what she did is she was reordering the existing Cartesian coordinate system and making it meaningful. And when we talked to her, we had a great honor of being part of a session with her. We talked with her about it. She said, the real importance of that is not the dreaded maps, the dreadlocks. The real meaning is that they had hours of discussion and community building with those women sitting in the Royal Geographical Society, an institution that not that long ago would have never had a person of color be allowed to enter. You see what I'm getting at? That's really powerful stuff. Yeah. That's the closest I got for you. All right.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Professor Alderman.